that you're here with us this morning as well. We hope that this will be an enjoyable time of worship for you. We also hope that you will come back and see us again after all of this is over and we can actually talk with you face to face again and get to know you better. Normally I say, hey, stay after we're dismissed and let us shake hands with you and get to know you better. But things are a little different right now. But we certainly are glad that you're here and hope that you will let us know if there's any way that we can help you and be of service to you as well. We want to look this morning at the subject faith, hope, and love in a time of doubt, hopelessness, and hatred. We look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and verse number 13. Paul says to the Corinthian church there, "So now faith, hope, and love abide. These three, but the greatest of these is love." And I want us to think about that Corinthian world, the church there in Corinth, and the society that they lived in that he's writing these things to. Corinth was in Greece. Many of them of the Christians there, would have come out of a world of idolatry. They would have come out of worshiping the famous Greek gods of old, those that the myths are written about. The ancient Greeks believed that there were many gods that had control over them and that they toyed with their lives, kind of the way a child might tease an animal. You take the little tennis ball with the dog and you act like you throw it and the dog runs and they thought that the gods treated them that way, that the gods would just enjoy watching them fight with each other, enjoy watching one fall in love with another and then breaking that apart. They thought their gods enjoyed things like that. They had a whole list of them. There were 13 main gods and goddesses that they worshipped. There were Zeus and Hades, Poseidon and Artemis, Apollo, Dionysus, Hera, Hestia, Ares, Athena, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, and Hermes. And when the Romans conquered, they, of course, brought all of their gods as well. And so all of the Roman gods had to kind of fit in there as well as the Greek ones. And then they had local little minor gods and goddesses that they worshiped. And then eventually even the emperor of Rome considered himself a god, and people had to worship the emperor. All through this confusion, this world of doubt, not knowing what to do or who to trust or what their gods wanted from them, Paul writes to a group of people who had a faith that was very different from the world around it. The Christian faith was unique in that society that they lived in. It was unique in several ways. Of course, the Christians believed in just one God instead of a baker's dozen. The Christians also, and of course there were Jews who only believed in one God, so they weren't entirely unique in that, but the Christians believed in a God who not only had come to earth, but who instead of toying with them for his pleasure, had sacrificed himself for their good, who had died for them. This was a radical concept, but that's what the Christians had come to believe. And so because of that, Paul writes to them about faith and about their faith. And this faith that can conquer doubt. And it's the same faith that we can have, you and I, today. A faith that conquers doubt, that conquers confusion. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2 and verse 22 through 5, Paul says, I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling, and my speech and my message were not in plausible words of men's wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Paul tells the Corinthians, the men around you, they're so wise, but they worship all these gods, and I'm trying to tell you about Jesus Christ. And that's who I want you to believe in and have faith in. A faith that comes from the power of God and not through the wisdom of men. He goes on to explain to them in chapter 13 at the beginning of that, from the verse that we looked at, but in verse 2 of that chapter, he says, if I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have all faith. I don't think any of us have all faith. But he said, even if I did, even if you or I, if we could have all faith, all the faith in the world, even so as to remove mountains, he says, but if I have not love, I am nothing. So we see here the connection between faith and love. Faith is a wonderful thing, but without love, it's nothing. He goes on, though, to encourage them to hold on to their faith. At the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 13 and 14, in verse 13 particularly, he says, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, and act like men. Be strong. Some people think that faith is a weakness. They think that believing in Jesus and being a part of the Christian religion, that religion is a crutch for the weak. But Paul says quite the opposite. Your faith makes you strong. Be strong. Be courageous. Stand firm in your faith. In 2 Corinthians, he continues talking to them about faith. He says in chapter 5 and verse 7, we walk by faith, not by sight. How do we walk in our Christian life? It's not by what we see, but it is by what we know to be true by faith. Not because we've seen it. We haven't seen Jesus. We didn't see him crucified. We're remembering that in the Lord's Supper that we did just a little while ago. But none of us saw that crucifixion. We have accounts of it, but we didn't see it. And then in 2 Corinthians 13, as he's closing out his final letter to the Corinthians, in verse 5 he says, examine yourselves to see whether you are in the faith. Test yourselves. Check and see daily, weekly, regularly. Check yourself. Examine yourself. See if you're living according to the faith in Christ that you should have. Make sure that you're passing that test. Test yourself. Today, just like the Corinthians, we live in a world where people worship gods they can see. Just like they built temples and idols and they worship those idols, we live in a world where people worship idols in essence. Now, they don't call them that. They don't build statues and offer sacrifices to them exactly, but they worship them nonetheless. Think about some of the things that human beings in our society today may worship. They may worship houses or vehicles, businesses or money, family or sports, degrees or shopping or entertainment, food, drugs, alcohol, the government, technology, sex. The list could go on and on of the things that people will worship, that they will bow down to, that they will sacrifice themselves to. Jesus said, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his soul? but people will give up their soul to worship at all of these different things, any of these different things. And it's different for different people. But of course, we need to escape from that. And like the Corinthian Christians, turn to a faith in Christ. But also, we need to have hope in a hopeless world. A time of hopelessness. The Corinthians, before they became Christians, the passage in Ephesians 2 would explain them just as well as explain the Ephesians. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. What a pitiful, sad, depressing description of a group of people. You were hopeless. You were without God. How sad. And yet, this same group of people who had been said to be without God and without hope in this world, now, as Christians, that wasn't the case anymore. Now they had been brought near to God. And the same was true with the Corinthian Christians. And the same is true with us. There was a time when we were hopeless and without God. But through Jesus Christ, we have hope. So Paul writes to the Corinthians, and he says, the plowman should plow in hope. The thresher should thresh in hope of sharing the crop. He goes on later on as he writes to them, he says, our hope for you is unshaken, for we know that as you share in our sufferings, you will also share in our comforts. And what were some of those sufferings? We sometimes think we have it hard. People complain, oh, my life's so difficult, so tough. And I know there are people that have had some rough times in their lives. There's no doubt about that. But let's look at what Paul says about the struggles and the afflictions that they faced. He says, we don't want you to be unaware, brothers, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. We were so utterly burdened beyond our strength that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death. But that was to make us rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. That's our hope. God raises the dead. He did it with Jesus Christ, and He'll do it with us. That's our hope. He delivered us from such a deadly peril, and He will deliver us. On Him we have set our hope, that He will deliver us again. And Paul is not just talking about delivering us from physical danger there. Our hope is that God will deliver us from death. That even if we die, Jesus said it Himself, whoever believes in me, even though he dies, yet he shall live. That's hope. And we have that hope in Jesus Christ. But then also, just like we have faith in a world of doubt, just like we have a hope in a world of hopelessness, we are to have love in a world of hatred. It's no doubt that the Corinthian church grew in spite of great hatred against them. In Acts chapter 18, we see the church started off peacefully. Paul preached and taught there for a period of time, and things were going well, but then people stirred up trouble against them. And in chapter 18 and verses 12 through 17, we see the Jews making an attack against Paul. And they bring him to the tribunal, and they're saying this man's trying to worship God in the wrong way, contrary to the law. Paul was going to defend himself, but the Roman proconsul Gallio, he didn't care. how the Jews worshipped or who or what they worshipped. He could care less. And so he just says, well, if he'd done some vicious crime, that'd be one thing. But so what? It's a question about your law. Who cares? Your God, not my business. I don't care. Verse 16, he drove them away. That wasn't good enough for them. They seized Sosthenes, who was a ruler of the synagogue, who had allowed Paul to teach there in the synagogue, and they drug him in front of that tribunal, and they beat him right there in front of the courthouse, so to speak. And Gallio didn't care. He just let them. The church in Corinth faced that kind of persecution. And yet, in spite of that, they grew. In spite of that, they loved. And they showed God's love to others. Paul encourages them to remember that what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the heart of man imagined, God has prepared for those who love Him. So first and foremost, the love has to be for Him. We cannot properly love ourselves, our families, our fellow man, until we first love God. 1 Corinthians 13, we've already read a couple of verses from that chapter. It's called the love chapter. The chapter of love, because there's so much about love in that chapter. It describes love. Beautiful verses 4 through 8. Love is patient and kind, does not envy or boast, it's not arrogant or rude, does not insist on its own way, it's not irritable or resentful, it doesn't rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things. So there you have your faith believes all things, and your hope hopes for all things. Love is what makes our faith and hope whole and complete. We saw earlier, faith without love is nothing. Love endures all things. Love never ends. You wonder why love is the greatest? There are several reasons that could be mentioned. But the greatest reason is faith. Well, when we get to heaven, we won't need faith anymore. We'll see it. We'll be there. We'll experience it. Won't need to believe it. We'll know it through experience. Hope. Well, what we hope for is something that we don't have yet. Once we have the resurrection, once we get there, we won't need to hope for it anymore. But love, even then, we'll still need love. Love is the greatest of these things. Paul goes on to explain to them, let all things be done in love. Everything you do, you need to do it in love. And then he says this, though. If anyone has no love for the Lord, let him be accursed. That's how important love is, that if it's missing in our life, that will bring a curse upon us. And then, of course, he closes that letter to the Corinthians. My love be with you all in Christ Jesus. The world's going to hate the followers of Jesus, just like it did in Corinth. It will continue to happen. It still happens to this day. John 17, 14, and 15, as Jesus is praying to the Father, he says, I've given them your word, and the world has hated them because they are not of the world. If the world's loving us, there's a problem. We're too much a part of them. The world will hate those that are not of the world. And you might think Jesus would say, well, rescue them from that. That's not what he prays, though. He says, I do not ask you to take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. Jesus asked us to be able to stay in this world of hatred, but to be a people of love and to be protected from Satan. And we can have faith that God answers that prayer. Satan cannot overcome God to have his way with us. We are protected if we'll cling to him and stay with him. In Matthew 5 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us that it used to be said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you can be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. Love. God is love. And if we're going to be like him, we're going to have to love as well. We see doubt and confusion all around us in our world today. We see hopelessness. We've seen, because of this situation with the coronavirus, we have seen people killing themselves out of fear and confusion. We've seen hatred, people hating each other, one political party hating the other, one group hating another group, one racial group or ethnic group hating another ethnic group. All of these things, hatred toward one another. That's the world we live in. Doubt, hopelessness, and hatred all around us. But we are to be the light of the world. We're to be the city set on a hill. We're to be the ones that are different than that. We're the ones who have faith, not doubt, certainty. Not hopelessness, but hope. And not hatred, but love. And I hope you will have that in your life this week and in the coming weeks as well. If you have a need to respond to God's invitation because of the doubt, the hatred, the hopelessness that you've experienced personally, I know that this isn't the same setting that we would have where it'd be easy to just walk down the aisle. But if you're feeling those things and they're overpowering you, reach out. No one can know, no one can help you if you won't reach out. Let me know. Let one of the elders know so that we can help you to overcome those doubts and hopelessness and hatred and help you to restore faith, hope, and love in your life. Let us know if we can help. Now we'll sing our closing song and close out.